handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er 8 9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds HEPT. Gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. Glad that you could be along for the ride. I got a cool book in the mail, and I was very happy to get it because it's a very easy read, and I like the structure of the book. So as a consequence, I have the author with us, and that's Michael Foley. And the title of the book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Christianity. Michael is an associate professor at Baylor University, and I think you've got, Michael, at least 2 other previous books on your resume too. Is that correct?
I've got a couple, yes. The most recent book before this is Drinking with the Saints, The Sinner's Guide to a Holy Happy Hour.
A lot of people think that they just can't go have a bourbon with a priest or something, but you can.
You can. Everything in moderation.
Well, thank you for being with us, Michael. I was kind of struck because there's a something on the cover of the book, quote, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried." What a remarkable thing, and that's so true, and it's kind of like the basis of your entire book, isn't it?
It is in a lot of respects. Christianity has not failed. Christians fail, but Christianity has not failed.
Indeed. Indeed. Now, thumbing through the book, Michael, I'm gonna there's a bunch of things I have here to ask, and some of it I'm gonna play a little bit of devil's advocate. Not that I'm not standing on the side of where you are, but
Sure.
What is the Library of Alexandria?
What was it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it was according to the legends or the reports, it was the largest collection of ancient manuscripts in the world. It was a treasure trove of wisdom, the greatest in all of antiquity. All the greatest wisdom of Greece and Rome was in this library in Alexandria, Egypt.
I spent about a month in Egypt, and that was one place that I did not get to. You were talking in the past tense, so
Yes.
why so?
Well, there's probably not much to see in current day Alexandria because it was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all kinds of legends and stories about who destroyed it and when it was destroyed. But I imagine you're asking because I bring that up in one of the chapters.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was only going to say, so it was some kind of a repository. Kind of explain that for us.
That it just had, the greatest works of philosophy and medicine and so forth. And according to the story, and again, we just don't know whether this is true or not, but during the Arab invasion of Egypt in the 7th century, the Muslims had conquered the city, and they approached the caliph and asked, "What should we do with this library?" And according to the report, the caliph replied, "If there are things in this library which contradict the Quran, they are dangerous and should be burned." And if there are things in this library that confirm the Quran, they are superfluous and should be burned. So he basically said, burn the
Destroy it
library.
all.
We don't need it. Now, I don't know if that's true, but the reason why I mention that in the story, in the book rather, is that a lot of modern secular people on the left think that Christianity has that attitude towards knowledge. They think that we burn libraries when we don't understand them. And one of the purposes of the book is to show that that's just ridiculous. That's utterly not true.
Mm. Chapter 8. It's titled Intolerance. And I hope I don't conflate something here. And if I do, I need you to correct me. But separation of church and state has a modern day definition, I would argue.
Sure.
And I would say separate Christianity and put it in a dark corner.
Yep.
That's kind of where we are today, isn't it?
Oh, I think so. And the irony is there is a new religion of tolerance, but the one thing it will not tolerate is Christianity. Because according to them, Christianity is intolerant, therefore it should be treated with intolerance. So it's a weird arrangement where we are being victimized and treated intolerantly in the name of toleration.
How in the world did we get here?
There's a screwy logic behind it.
Well, look, Michael, are we hear this new thing about holy war, and then we hear the thing about crusades. The crusades was evil, and I would argue that today we have necessarily a crusade of revenge.
Mm-hmm.
Did I get some of that right?
Well, that is the common narrative, and that's what President Clinton said, that's what President Obama said, that they basically said the reason 9/11 happened was because of the Crusades. That this is the West's own fault, that we were these greedy imperialists who invaded the Holy Land in the Middle Ages, and Islam has never forgotten this outrage, and 9/11 is simply the latest fruit of all that. But the historical record is totally different from that story. For one thing, the Crusades were not an act of aggression. They were an act of self-defense against a very aggressive military foe. And then the other thing, which is really fascinating, and I didn't know this until I started researching it for the book, up until the 19th century, Muslims in the Middle East had no problem with the Crusades. After all, they won. They were the victors in that military conflict, so they never thought of themselves as victims. It was only when members of the Middle East started matriculating at elite universities in Europe that they got this narrative about imperialism. And so they took this Western story, which was ironically anti-Western, brought it back with them to the Middle East in the early 20th century, and turned it into a cause for Arab nationalism. So initially it was just a secular movement. It was not a revivified Islam. It was simply wanting to have our nation back from these colonists. But then eventually this secular nationalism and the story of the Crusades morphed into Islamic fundamentalism. And so by the time the myth of the Crusades was filtered through the addled brain of Osama bin Laden, he was blaming both Christians and Jews for the Crusades, which is historically ridiculous. So if you want to blame someone for 9/11, blame the anti-Western Westerners who trotted out this myth 100 years ago.
Christianity is no longer in vogue.
True.
It's not full of adventure. It's not edgy, which everybody kind of is today. So I would say that's pretty much the current attitude of the left and the quote non-believers these days. But But this was a very slow process that I would argue necessarily worked. And now that whole thing is about not being in vogue is manifesting itself. And so if you are claiming any kind of attachment to Christianity, then you're an outcast and you need to stay in the corner, right?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of that going on, especially in elite circles, politics, academia, journalism, filmmaking. Christians need not apply. I think there is definitely a bias against Christians today, especially in these elite circles.
And so those that attend have to be kind of themselves holding on to something. It's an antiquated doctrine, right?
Well, I like the way you said it earlier. People don't think that Christianity is full of adventure. And that is the common perception. But boy, could there be nothing further from the truth than that. The greatest adventure is Christianity. It is an exciting romance with God, and it's difficult, and it's fraught with danger and the possibility of failure, but the Christian life is the adventurous life.
I think so too, and that's kind of why I framed the question that way. And because goodness, Michael, it's prevailed. I mean, centuries, and yet the entire book, the entire model is now a popular subject to destroy, right?
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of force multiplying in this. That I don't know that it necessarily snuck up on us, but it snuck up on us.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do?
Well, for a long time, and this goes back to Marxism, Christianity has been seen as the enemy of progress. And that Marxist accusation has been adopted by the new left as well and used to quarantine and discredit Christianity.
Nobody wants to give it a try now, do they? I mean, the Bible's antiquated. It's clearly out of step with where we are today with, phone apps and social media and all those kinds of things, because people think that there is no tangible evidence. There's no tangible truth or proof. And I say there is, and yet there's a failure to remind people of archaeology, the things that are coming out, and where they were found. So is it antiquated, Michael?
Oh, absolutely not. The Bible is one of the most exciting things you could ever read, and I think if you approach it with an open mind and an open heart, you realize that something important is being communicated here, and it's not antiquated. One of the things I love about the Bible is no matter from what time or age you come from, it's arresting. Even for Christians, there are these jarring, disturbing scenes in the Old Testament, the sacrifice of Isaac or things of that nature where you think, what is going on here? The Bible doesn't spoon feed you some kind of easy little narrative. It's jarring. And ironically, the more of a believer you are, the more jarring it is. So again, this is an adventure.
7 deadly sins of modern thought.
Yes.
Walk us through those that you describe in the book.
Well, that's the final chapter of my politically incorrect guide to Christianity. And in some respects, it's the chapter I'm the most proud of because I wrote it. When I started the book, I didn't think about this chapter at all. But as I was writing the book, and I kept coming against these accusations against Christianity, I noticed that a lot of times it wasn't so much that they were objecting to Christian doctrine. In some respects, the secular left's criticism of Christianity is more fundamental. In other words, the secular left doesn't get angry at the fact that we believe there are three persons in one God, but they get really angry when we believe that men are men and women are women and should know which bathroom to use.
Sorry.
So part of it was like, this is not a war against uniquely Christian doctrine. This is a war against common sense. And Christians have common sense, and therefore they get indicted in this war against common sense. So that's where the 7 deadly sins of modern thought come from. I just kept finding these 7 errors recurring in their logic, coming up again and again and again, so I listed them out.
Michael, you've got, from my count, about 16 or 17 pages of bibliography. So it looked to me that you were using some wide sourcing. And so how did you come to use all these source preferences?
Well, as you mentioned before, I do teach at Baylor University. My background is theology. So a lot of these things are things that I teach in class. These are books that I read with my students. And then there are some things that, some areas that were new to me, and I would just sort of rummage around and try to find the best book on the subject.
Mm-hmm. You've got a lot of books in here that you are sarcastically telling people not to read.
Yes, and that is a convention of the pig guides. This is part of this series from Regnery. I think we're up to over 24 of these. The politically incorrect guide to the South, the politically incorrect guide to American history, so on and so forth. And it is a really neat convention that it's very impish. There's something kind of tongue-in-cheek. The content is serious, but it's always packaged in a kind of a playful way. And so you're right, they have these little call-outs with a little icon of a pig, and it says, a book they don't want you to read.
I like it. There was a lot of struggle that went on, and you take the struggles going from history, obviously in the Old Testament, all the way up through, Marxism and where we are today. Is there a time, Michael, that you found that there were specific struggles that became more prominent than others?
Could you say a little more about your question, Denise?
Well, I guess the question, let me try to say it this way. Was there a period of time or a specific type of struggle or location through history that was more important, more meaningful than others necessarily that you found that may have surprised you?
I see. Yeah, no, good question. I suppose the area that interests me the most is the 16th century, when you get the rise of modernity. And modernity is a big theme in the book because it's not the arch enemy of Christianity, and in many respects it grows out of Christianity. But in our own day and age, modernity has become problematic. It's become increasingly antagonistic to Christianity. So one of the big questions in my mind is, how did that happen? And where do we go from here? I mean, do we all just become Amish and reject modernity altogether? Do we kind of cherry pick it, pick what we like? I mean, here we are talking on the radio. That's modern. Where do we draw the line as Christians in embracing what is modern and rejecting it?
Where is the message of Christianity? Where is it failing, and when did it start to fail? Such that it doesn't have its prominence and its loyalty today?
Well, again, I think it has a lot to do with that history of modernity, that Christianity was in crisis in the 16th century. You had, corruption in the Catholic Church. You had the Protestant Reformation. And at the same time that you had this fight within Christendom, you had the rise of modernity. And not all of modernity was bad, but a lot of modern thinkers took advantage of the division in Christianity and did a kind of a divide and conquer, playing different groups off each other, so that while Protestants and Catholics were busy fighting each other, secularism would rise up as this sort of third power, and eventually it supplanted both.
We have several denominations to Christianity. Why is there a distinction here, and who owns who is the best at messaging?
Oh, gosh, I don't feel equipped to answer that question.
I don't necessarily know that I blame you on that one, because we've got the Episcopalians and we've got the Baptists and we got the Presbyterians, but who seems to be holding on? What denomination seems to be holding on the best? Maybe I should say it that way.
From what I have been able to see, it seems that the churches that actually do the best are the ones that compromise the least on their doctrine. One of the things we saw in the 20th century is the more that mainline Protestant denominations watered down their teaching in order to be more welcoming, in order to fit in with the changing times, the more they did that, the more people they lost and the fewer people they brought back in. Because essentially, to put it in sort of a marketing term, they lost a brand identity. They just became indistinguishable from the rest of the culture. And if you're indistinguishable from the rest of the culture, why should I have to get up Sunday morning, put on my clothes, when I can just, open the New York Times and become a good liberal? So there is no incentive. But it's the churches that say, no, we hold to these ageless, timeless teachings, and we're not compromising. Those are the ones that attract people.
I am delighted with that answer. I really am. So thank you for that. So if people are really struggling because they have been not introduced to any of it, they have stayed so far away, they have never had, they were never in touch or lost touch, then the Vatican isn't in charge of Christianity. We don't have to look to the Pope to tell us, where we need to be. You see what I'm saying? I mean, people they don't necessarily know where to start here at this point, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of confusion out there, that's for sure.
I would say that these denominations have an awful lot of work to do, and that they necessarily ought to be a little introspective. I think there's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of public relations, and there's a lot of work to do when it comes to history. And I think that some of these leaders, these religious leaders, all need to kind of come together and say, we got a problem here, we need to address it. Maybe they need to start a new plan.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and in a sense, I don't blame them for their failures. I empathize, because it is really hard to communicate the gospel in this culture. We don't own the media. Every media message is going to be skewed, and any kind of social justice aspect of Christianity, which is an important part of our life, care for the pure, gets co-opted by the left. And so it's really hard, I think, to really communicate the entire gospel message in this day and age.
Yeah, I see some efforts, but it's just not gaining any traction. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Michael Foley, the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Christianity, Why It's True, Why It Matters, and Why It's Good for You. And just thanks for your time, Michael. It's been an interesting conversation, and it's an interesting book because I think you can start anywhere in the book and not be lost because of the work that you put into it. So thank you so much, and good luck with it and its success.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, more coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you these two 24/7 streams of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. Talk America Radio is a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. Please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. You can contribute monthly or send us a one-time amount. We'll put it to good use continuing to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. We've got Michaela Dodge with us from the Daily Signal, which is a remarkable piece that the Heritage Foundation hosts, and they have some great investigative journalists over there that are doing some good work. And Michaela Dodge has actually done that because she co-wrote a piece on some violations of Russia. And I would say there's lots of them, but at least she drove a stake in the ground and started off with one when it came to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. What a title. So, Michaela, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
What made you kind of dig into this? Because it's kind of like a topic nobody is really having a discussion about.
I actually deal with nuclear weapons and missile defense policy issues, and because Russia has a massive nuclear weapons modernization program, I guess I tend to watch it a little more closely than others. And as we're gearing up for our own nuclear weapons modernization, it just becomes very important to see what others are doing.
What an interesting thing to concentrate on. I saw a report too earlier in the week that Russia was also increasing their underground nuclear weapons arsenal. Is that part of your investigations?
I mean, Russia has had massive nuclear weapons modernization program in recent years. The huge recapitalization started in about 2010-2011 timeframe. So the numbers are increasing, the systems are coming online, and the United States continues to really lag behind. And so it's becoming more and more important that we address these disparities in our production complexes and in our weapons.
Now, the one particular violation, Michelle, that you made reference to was the intermediate range missiles. Is that right? The ones that go up to what, 5,500 kilometers?
Yeah, between 500 to 5,500.
Now that class was pretty much eliminated altogether in a previous treaty, correct?
Yeah, the INF Treaty eliminated the missiles of those ranges, but in recent years we've seen Russia violate the treaty and start deploying the capabilities that are in violation of the treaty, while the United States has failed to respond in any meaningful way so far. And in fact, it took very long time for the Obama administration to even acknowledge that there is a violation of the treaty.
You mentioned just now and in your piece about the deployments. Can you elaborate on that? Are they placing them other places in the globe? Can define that if you would?
The way I understand it is that the Russians moved from tests in about 2008 timeframe to production a couple of years later to deployments, and now have a battalion or maybe more armed with these missiles. They are in Russia. They are militarily significant to U.S. allies in Europe and to our forward deployed forces. And then politically, not responding to these violations sends Russia a signal that we do not value, that we sort of cannot really challenge them on arms control violations.
There was a new one or newer one or one that was newly listed that you had mentioned, which is the 9M729. Can you define what that is?
It's a designator that the U.S. government uses to sort of publicly identify the type of a missile that Russia is deploying. For a while, we did not know exactly what type of a missile was the missile in question. And now that the information is public, I think it makes it easier for allies to acknowledge that these violations are happening and to help the United States to exercise pressure on Russia to either come back to the compliance or to act in a way that protects our interests.
Michaela, are there, when we sign these treaties, and that they're, because all of us little people out here don't read them and wouldn't necessarily have a reason to unless it's brought to our attention, and much less that we understand it. But when there are these treaties and there are violations, are we defining what those violations are and a consequence to those violations? In other words, are there supposed to be sanctions? Do we, trot on over to the UN and just sign a letter of condemnation? I mean, is there a punishment?
So, the kind of implementation and enforcement of international treaties is the weakest point. And it's particularly true for arms control agreements. They generally say what is prohibited in very, very technical language, which of course the Soviets and today the Russians use to their advantage to further gain advantage over the United States, that because the United States generally tends to over-comply with international agreements.
Mhm.
The Russians kind of push the boundaries and push the limits to get more advantage. But
So
there is no mechanism, that would say if you violate this provision of the treaty, this is going to happen.
yeah, I had a feeling you were going to say that. So in other words,
Yeah.
if the treaty says you can't paint it gray and we're that specific, then they'll go, okay. And so they paint it yellow, right?
Or they paint it gray and say it's blue.
Oh, yeah, they do like to lie about those kinds of things, don't they?
Sure do.
Where is Congress on this? Has anybody kind of raised the alarm bell on this one? I would think if anybody else, Rubio probably has, but I don't know. I haven't heard anybody, with a megaphone on it. Have you?
Well, Congress has actually been driving force that push the administration to seriously explore options to respond to the INF Treaty violations. That is, the Obama administration. It continues to do the same and sort of provide guidance to the Trump administration. And for example, the latest National Defense Authorization Bill contains provisions that would sanction individuals affiliated with these programs. So there are options and steps that the United States can take, but has not had political will to take so far, unfortunately.
Where is NATO on this?
NATO just today released a fairly strong statement condemning Russian violations and calling for or calling upon the Russians to clarify, to come back to compliance with the treaty and clarify the steps that are taking, which it doesn't sound like much, but it is a lot better than when we had NATO countries say, we are not sure whether these violations are actually occurring. So that's progress in terms of NATO, and we have to remember that there is political meaning to the Russian violations, which is to further disunity between the United States and the European allies.
Congress can impose sanctions, and on these kinds of things, they can. Well, let me say they can recommend sanctions. I would necessarily say, and make some pretty robust recommendations on those, and try and advance that kind of thing. We just signed the National Defense Authorization Act. Was there anything in there that you're aware of that pointed to these violations?
Yeah, in fact, Congress did call for sanctions on entities affiliated with this program.
Has there been any kind of response out of the Kremlin?
The Russian line is that the United States is violating the treaty, which the United States is not violating the treaty, and that they require proof of the violations, which for some time we couldn't provide because it would most likely reveal intelligence and sources and methods. So that wasn't quite an option, and of course the Russians would love to see what kind of information we have. But it's sort of the classical mirror imaging, we are violating the treaty, so the United States must violate it too, whereby, if anything, history is on the U.S. side, where Russia has violated pretty much every single arms control agreement it's ever signed with the United States. So far, New START might be an exception, but partly because it's not particularly well written as far as technical details go. So it's very important for the United States to follow on these violations, to signal to other countries, too, that agreements are worth the piece of paper that they're written on.
Are there any other countries that are standing with us on these violations? In other words, are they providing evidence as well as the United States?
I do not know that for a fact, but I would not be surprised.
Well, that would be. Now, you had mentioned some other treaties, including the Chemical Weapons Treaty, the Helsinki Final Act, and then the Presidential Nuclear Initiative. Can you kind of elaborate on those as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me look at this. So, once we signed Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention with Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we actually found out that the Soviet Union used those treaties as a pretext to launch just massive biological and chemical weapons programs.
Mm-hmm.
So
before, as a caveat to that, during the later part of the Bush administration, I think, maybe it was the early part, doesn't matter, but we actually paid to get rid of some of their chemical weapons, correct? I mean, we sent, several envoys over there and literally went through some of their older facilities, and we paid the money to get that stuff out of there. So since that time, we are still seeing some of those violations.
I mean, we did have it was called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, and Russia stopped that program a couple of years ago. As a part of kind of worsening relations between the two countries. But I mean, the larger point stands. Russia is not a trustworthy partner. The United States does not have a good track record in terms of bringing Russia back into compliance with arms control agreements. And it's about time we take action and take these matters, respond to these matters more actively than just continuing what we've always done, which is, write letters and raise the issue at the international fora and not do much of anything, really.
Explain to us what the Helsinki Final Act is.
So the Helsinki Final Act was a Cold War agreement that part of it was that it guaranteed some freedoms and liberties to countries that were part of the Soviet Union, but were not the Soviet Union. And it provided very important platform to sort of freedom movements in those countries. It was written in 1975, so it is one of those sort of Cold War relics that was important for the demise of the Soviet Union, even though at the time we did not envision it as such.
And would it necessarily make reference to what countries? Would that include, some of the Baltic nations or any of the new stans that exist, or Ukraine?
I mean, it involved countries that were part of the Soviet Union but were not Russia. So countries like Czechoslovakia, the Baltic nations, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and such.
One of the newest disputes and the newest acts that is floating around the globe is the Magnitsky Act. And that seems to be one that has the Kremlin and Putin himself probably the most angry. I happen to communicate from time to time with Bill Browder myself, but can you, for the sake of the audience, describe what the Magnitsky Act is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Magnitsky Act was sort of a follow-on or modernization of the old kind of Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and it's named after a lawyer who was unlawfully killed by the Putin regime and just died in horrendous conditions. And the aim of the bill is to sanction Russian entities who are involved in illegal acts and human rights abuses. And of course, Russia hates to be shown ways in which it is not a normal country. And this is one of the ways how we can highlight people and individuals that are involved in just these horrendous abuses.
Yeah, this one, we Bill Browder is traveling the globe and hitting up several countries, and he's making the presentations on why they need to sign on to the Magnitsky Act. I mean, not only was Sergei Magnitsky murdered because he had the corruption goods and the evidence on what the Russian officials within the Russian Federation were doing, but kind of getting out of your realm maybe a little bit, there are several other dead bodies, and it's kind of interesting that nobody is including in that conversation the other dead, I guess, Russian dissidents, correct?
Yeah, there's been campaign going on in Russia to kill and target sort of most effective opponents of the Putin regime. So another examples could be journalist Anna Politkovskaya or opposition leader, I think Boris Nemtsov was his name.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm sure I'm forgetting some. This is not my area of expertise, but
it's fair enough.
But we have seen this campaign of intimidation, murder, and discrimination on the part of the Kremlin to secure Putin's power, because Russia is a big country, but it also has tremendous internal problems, and it's not a particularly strong country aside from a nuclear weapons arsenal, but it's very backwards economically, dependent on natural resources, and does have internal problems.
If you were to forecast where we go with the United States and NATO and some of our allies in isolating Russia for, I don't know, Michelle, countless violations, is this something that you think is necessarily going to drag on, and that we would not necessarily come to some cogent resolution between all these country leaders with what to do with Russia?
I am not all that optimistic because there just seem to be quite a few competing interests for the foreseeable future. And countries tend to be fairly pragmatic in a way they approach their international relations. That being said, Russia is already isolated in many ways, and it is not considered sort of your good partner. It's more a menace you have to deal with and you have to pay attention to.
It's almost, you almost can't have any kind of a discussion on foreign policy or on a global basis where Russia doesn't get included somehow, right?
Yeah, it is. It is a global actor, but it is a weakening global actor with many problems.
Do you? I guess in your travels with arms control and paying attention to what Russia is doing and not doing, are you able to collaborate with, those out of the Department of Defense or the outside arms control experts and even those of allies?
Nuclear weapons and arms control community is fairly small. So we interact quite a bit. We know each other's work. We follow each other. So we do that quite a bit. And at the end of the day, to accomplish anything, to have support for nuclear weapons modernization, to have support to address Russia's arms control violations, you have to have partnerships, and you have to have good arguments, and you have to kind of foster the discussion.
Does the International Atomic Energy Agency have any jurisdiction?
On arms control violations?
Yeah.
Not on the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The IAEA is in charge of trying to see if countries are violating their obligations in relation to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Okay.
But it doesn't have sort of enforcement powers that lies with the United Nations Security Council. So the IAEA would make recommendations. The IAEA's Board of Governors would make recommendations would report findings to the United Nations Security Council, who then would decide on the course of action.
And yet Russia has veto power on that council, correct?
Correct.
So it's kind of like a circle argument here that it's never, I mean, the Russians have necessarily postured themselves where there can be no consequence, there can be no punishment, and they can deny, which they clearly have done, even when it came to the chemical weapons violations in Syria and in their own country. So I guess today looks like next year, doesn't it? Or next year looks like today?
I mean, it's true only to an extent, because the United States does not need UN Security Council to address the Russian violations. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there are quite a few things we can do, ourselves or in cooperation with allies to counter Russian violations. And, the first good step is even to get allies to recognize that Russia is, in fact, in violation of the treaty. So that's good news on that front. As you mentioned, there is legislation in Congress for the United States to take action against people involved in the INF treaty program. The president can decide to explore military options in response to those violations, which is what the Department of Defense has been working on for a couple of years now. So we don't need, we are not forced to sort of let these violations go unpunished.
Nor do we have to toe the line of the United Nations Security Council either, correct?
Correct. It is our own political will that is obstacle in these things.
Well, you have a fascinating assignment here, Michaela, and I commend you for the work that you're doing and the collaboration that it takes. It's quite an interesting field of objective here. So well done, and thanks so much for the article and explaining some of these piece parts to us. And most of all, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
I appreciate it, and thank you so much for paying attention to this important and sometimes very obscure issue. I really appreciate it.
Yes, they are important and certainly obscure. Well done, and come back again soon.
You can't handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie 435 9er 21. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie 47 tree 9er 89er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. I'm very delighted to be joined by Diego Echeverri, who's the Director of Coalitions for Concerned Veterans for America. It's been a while since Diego's been with us, and been a while, I guess, since then that we have had a discussion about the Veterans Administration, Veterans Health, and where we're going. And so Diego tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, I want to talk about the Veterans Empowerment Act. So I'm so happy that he did. And thank you, Diego, and welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you, Denise. Pleasure to be on again.
We're still intermittently hearing about veterans that are dying waiting for care. And Diego, I mean, this has kind of been, somehow we thought that, a year or so ago, or maybe 2 years ago, that whole paradigm would have been eliminated completely. But we haven't gotten past that, have we?
That's right. It's been a long road to reform the VA, and the 8 years of the Obama administration were quite difficult. It was a difficult process to get real reforms passed and administered by the Secretary of the VA. They were non-cooperative. They really took the sides of the unions on any issue regarding VA reform, more accountability, more transparency, and so that made it really difficult. And what we've seen since President Trump has taken office, and since he promoted Secretary Shulkin, Dr. Shulkin was in charge of the VHA before. Now he's the secretary. We've seen a big transformation that is encouraging for my organization, Concerned Veterans for America. What we've seen also is a critical mass of support for real reforms in the legislature, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And there are currently several bills that the my organization, Concerned Veterans for America, is tracking and that we see as making all the right moves to fix the VA. What we have at the VA is a culture of mismanagement, misallocation of funds, misconduct, lack of accountability, and corruption. And so what we've fought for in the past is, we worked very closely with Marco Rubio on the VA accountability measures, and we worked really hard with him on the VA Accountability Act, and that was signed into law by the president this summer. And what we're seeing a lot of since the president took over is more transparency. They put up a website that showed the misconduct, the disciplinary actions of the VA employees, which they did on their own, which is exciting. And you never would have seen something like that during the Obama administration.
Yeah, in government, much less
in the Obama administration that was protecting the unions and taking the side of the AFGE. So now what we've had is incremental efforts on the part of organizations like Concerned Veterans for America and right-minded legislators to put more accountability measures into the VA. So we've had 2 pieces of legislation that increase accountability. And now what we're hoping to do is get past this piece of legislation, H.R. 4457, the Veterans Empowerment Act, which cuts red tape at the VA by restructuring it to a government-chartered nonprofit. And what would happen is that all the hospitals, the VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, their medical facilities would be part of this government-chartered nonprofit. Currently, the VHA is constrained by bureaucratic red tape and process, and it makes it really difficult to best serve our veterans in the current structure. And we're seeing that this bureaucracy and these problems are plaguing different programs like the Veterans Choice Program. And in order to make the VHA operate more efficiently and provide the care that our veterans earned and that they were promised, the VEA is what we're calling it, the Veterans Empowerment Act, would restructure these hospitals into government chartered nonprofit corporation that would be called the Veterans Accountable Care Organization, so the VACO. And this new structure would allow the VA to better integrate into the private sector, and with the private sector, it gives the VA more flexibility to respond to the changing healthcare needs of the veteran population, because as you know, it's changing drastically. We have the Vietnam generation, the Korea generation that's dying off, and then we're dealing with a much different generation of veterans with your Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. And so that's the main thing it does, is it turns the VA chain into a nonprofit. And then secondly, it gives veterans more choice in their healthcare decisions by creating something called the Veterans Health Insurance Program, which will allow veterans to seek access to care outside the VA without having to deal with the VA as a bureaucratic middleman in the process. So a veteran would have an insurance card, the Veterans Health Insurance Program, and they could go to any healthcare provider and see that if they choose not to go to the VA. What we want is the VA to compete for veterans. And if veterans don't want to go to their local VA or have to travel hours to the closest VA, that they should be able to go to any healthcare provider of their choosing, just like we use our other benefits as veterans, just like we use our education benefits in the GI Bill or our VA home loan. We should be able to use our health benefits wherever we want. And we shouldn't be constrained to a bureaucratic system that is failing us and has been failing us for decades.
When you have to, I mean, now the veterans can seek care outside the VA, private practice, if you will. But there's an awful lot of stipulations to that, isn't there?
Yeah. So what currently exists is a system that's not real choice, even though it's called the Veterans Choice Program.
Yeah.
And this program was created shortly after the scandal in Phoenix as a stopgap measure, as a temporary fix to the problem of wait times at the VA. So they created this system, but what happened is that the Veterans Choice Program ran out of money in this past summer, and they had to last minute get some more money into that system, and it keeps running out of money. It's projected to run out of money again this month, and unfortunately, it's not even real choice, because it's what happens is that when you are either 40 miles away or 30 days out from your appointment, then you qualify, even though that was recently removed, those stipulations. That was what was called the 30-40 rule. And then what happens is after that, you get put into a veteran list. And then that list goes to a third-party provider that then makes the appointment for you. So so what was happening is that veterans, because of the manipulation of wait times, which is endemic to the VA, veterans were never really being given their real consideration, their real eligibility for this program, because you had veterans who were put on secret wait lists before they were given appointments. And because of that, some veterans had to wait 3 months. Some even had to wait 300 days for appointment. So because of the system that currently exists in the VA, veterans weren't really being given the right access to that kind of quality care outside of the VA. And what's been happening also is that a lot of private healthcare providers in and around these VA bases or these military bases or in and around the VA, they're not taking the choice program anymore because of the difficulty in recouping that money from the VA, and their billing departments are not getting paid. So what's happening across the board is that the fixes that they've made that are the government fixes haven't been working to expand choice. So what we need is to restructure the VA into an organization that will have to compete for the veterans. And we need an organization that works more like a Mayo Clinic or like a Cleveland Clinic, which will give veterans premier level, premier access, premier quality care, blue ribbon care for our veterans that they deserve.
Diego, where are we with Secretary Shulkin? Is he better than the previous secretaries? I think that he is. You need to correct me. But it's still a cumbersome, slow process. What kind of a grade would you give Shulkin?
Well, I would give him a decent grade. I think that what we're seeing now even without prodding or asking on the part of organizations, just without external pressure, they've already taken strong measures to increase transparency at the VA and also to increase accountability. And I think that Secretary Shulkin realized the situation really early on when he tried to fire a VA employee who was caught watching pornography while they were at work. And when he couldn't fire that person quickly, he realized, all of those civil servant protections that get in the way of creating a culture of accountability in the workplace at the VA. He realized how difficult it was, and that's why he advocated in the Senate VA committee and in the House VA committee for the VA Accountability Act that we were also advocating for. So what we're seeing on the part of the VA secretary is that we are aligned with him philosophically in terms of the fixes for the VA, and we're seeing that he really is paying attention to the White House in terms of what should happen. And he doesn't have an easy job, right? It's an organization with over 300,000 employees, and the unions have a lot of statutory protections. They have these 100 plus years of civil servant laws that protect them, and it's a tough thing to navigate. On top of that, it's an organization with a lot of government bureaucracy, and with a lot of people who are entrenched there, and there are also a lot of veterans that work at the VA, and there are a lot of good people, a lot of folks who really are in it for the right reasons and who care about the patients. The problem is that there's the folks who are found guilty of misconduct, and the bad actors are the ones that give the organization a really bad name. So they're facing a serious crisis of culture, and the VA needs strong leadership at the top in the White House, and they need the tools given to them by the Senate and the House to be able to really act on fixing the culture, and they need to have leadership and a culture change, drastic culture change, so that they're able to meet the needs of the veteran. And so that's why it's so important that we also have laws that are introduced that fix that structure, because what's happened is, even though we've had these attempts for incremental change at the VA with the several VA accountability acts, what we're seeing is that despite all of that, the culture is just so entrenched at the VA that from our perspective, really the only way to change it is a restructuring, because the problem with the VA is that the culture is a symptom of the structure and the operational system that they have.
Well, it seems like there's more protection over the as you say, the structure than there is the veteran. I mean, they're protecting their own instead of who they're there for. Correct?
Absolutely. You've said it perfectly. Okay. That's exactly. It's almost as if the organization exists for the employee instead of for the veteran, and that's a huge problem.
Is there an ethics committee that's assigned to the VA or works for the VA, such that if you've got some of these rogue employees or staff personnel that are just not behaving or performing within the definition of the job title, that they are necessarily removed and then gone through an ethics, and they go through an ethics investigation, at which time there can be some kind of a discipline kind of thing, because law enforcement, every case where a shot is fired, a police officer is always put on paid leave until there's an investigation. I would say that same model should be applied to those that are inside the VA. Is there anything like that?
So there's a couple different things that are like what you described. So the VA has an inspector general that is separate from the VA, and what we're seeing regularly from the VA inspector general is investigations related to wait time manipulation, criminal investigations also. And what we're seeing is that with the inspector general, like I mentioned, monthly they come out with a new report, either finding mismanagement of funds, misallocation of funds, corruption, and it's important also for whistleblowers to make sure, and that's what the VA Accountability Whistleblower Protection Act partly does, is it empowers whistleblowers and provides more safety for them to come forward with information, and that's a big reason as to why we found out about the Phoenix scandal and many other situations in Tampa and in our home state of Florida. Many whistleblowers have come forward and shared even images of things like cockroach infestations, and I believe there was a whistleblower that came forward last year with the veteran that was hidden in the shower who had died, and his body had been hidden in the shower in his room for over 9 hours because they didn't follow the right processes for when a patient expires, and so a lot of these problems come to light because of whistleblowers, which we're glad for. We need more of those. So the Inspector General also, a lot of the reasons why we know about some of these really bad problems of manipulation of wait times is because the Inspector General publishes this information publicly. And they also now have been sharing the ratings of the VA hospitals in the state of Florida. And what we're seeing is not the right kind of movement that we want to see in a state as important as Florida in terms of our veteran population. You know, we have 1.5 million veterans throughout the state, and we have 3 facilities in the state of Florida that rate 2 stars out of 5 or under, and that's out of 8 facilities. So if we have 3 facilities that are 2 stars, that is really, really sad, given the fact that what we're seeing is billions and billions of dollars in increase to the VA budget, despite the fact that the veteran population is shrinking. And we're seeing them climbing 100,000 employees in the last 10 years, despite the fact that there's and then of course, you know, your wait times are getting worse and worse. So what we're seeing is that for every dollar we put into the VA, we get less out of it. So it's becoming the ROI. We're seeing a negative correlation in ROI in how the VA works and the quality of care that our veterans get. So it's not an issue of money. A lot of people will say, oh, well, maybe the VA needs more money. It's the opposite, because what we see is every time we give them more money, they get worse. So that's why we need the Veterans Empowerment Act. We need the VA to completely restructure, because once an organization is in the situation where money can't fix it, changing laws to make it easier to fire people and doing that multiple times. I mean, we've had 2 VA Accountability Acts pass Congress. And if that doesn't work, then what we need now is a complete restructuring of the organization. It has to come out of the government. The hospital side of it has to come out from government. It has to become a government-chartered nonprofit with congressional oversight, with oversight from government still. And they need to compete for the veterans. And we're going to get better investment on our money if veterans who have service-related issues continue going to the VA, and those that don't have issues that are directly connected to their service are able to go to the civilian side, where there's a comparative advantage there. The doctors and the healthcare system already knows how to take care of people that don't have these types of combat-specific issues. They can take care of it in a timely fashion, where there's a marketplace that you can spread the patients across with specialized people who can handle it easily and quickly, and treat veterans in a timely fashion. This is what we think needs to happen to fix veterans' health care. Because at the end of the day, the VA is doing a lot of things now that it was never intended to originally do. Even though they have these pharmacies which are wonderful and that give cheap medications to our patients, the downside of it in the state of Florida, for example, is the fact that a lot of these pharmacies at the VA are losing narcotics left and right. In the last year, around $14,000 worth of fentanyl and oxycodone went missing from Florida VA pharmacies. So we really, really need to change the structure and create more accountability. And some of these actions that are criminal need to be taken care of as if they were criminal. And we need to stop this system of having these bad actors then go out into the civilian side, because that's also another issue that's happening. It was published a couple of weeks ago that 90% of the disciplinary actions that occur at the VA are not shared with the proper authorities. So what you end up having is physicians who commit malpractice,
Mm-hmm.
or bad actors who are nurses or other people who break the law and who get fired from the VA, and then they're able to go out into the civilian side because the VA protects its own and it doesn't share that information with the proper authorities. So you have people out there who are now seeing patients who are civilians who are doing that because the VA didn't properly share that information with the right authorities, and these people should be stripped of their licenses. In some cases, they should be in prison. So there's so many issues at the VA that it's not just one. It's not just one case. It's like a patient who has everything wrong with them, and there's really an incremental. We have to have a full court press to fix this.
I'd like to see a real documentary, such that when you've got these committees in Congress, they're forced to essentially become a patient and see the world through the patient's eyes. That explains the malpractice of the doctors, the people sitting around, dispensing and stealing narcotics. The delays and the paperwork and the time, all the little things that happen. Because I know that you got people in the VA, you mentioned earlier, you got people in the VA that do remarkable good work, but their good work it's lost because you still have these terribly cumbersome, scandalous things that go on, and therein lies the sadness of it all. I mean, it's got a bad reputation. People just say VA, and it's now got the same reputation as the FBI does. You know what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and the problem too is that we're talking about very specific situations, right? With regard to what's wrong at the VA. But let's talk about the human cost and the cost on the veteran that has. So we're not just talking about veterans dying while they're waiting for care. I mean, and because we kind of pass over that, yes, several hundred veterans died while waiting for care. But let's talk about, who these people are, the effects on their family, right? And then also the effects on the community and the egregious nature of some of these situations, like the gentleman who died and who was hidden in his shower stall. I mean, what kind of way is that to treat the body of a veteran?
Or anybody.
To treat the body of anybody, yes. But what kind of way at a veterans hospital, that are supposed to be there, the entire purpose of it is to take care of veterans, those who bore the brunt of battle, the burden of battle. And then you have situations where veterans are committing suicide in the parking lots because of the multiple cancellations. The fact that their providers are unavailable, or they cancel on them last minute, and this is after driving, and then months waiting for appointments. There was earlier in November, there was a story about I think it was in USA Today, where a vet set himself on fire.
I saw
after
that.
You saw that, right?
Yeah.
After numerous appointment cancellations. I mean, this is the situation that veterans are facing with our healthcare system. They are literally lighting themselves on fire, waiting because they can't get the right treatment. And every American should be shocked and outraged at the way that we are treating our service members, and the fact that we're allowing political interests to be more important than the health interests of our veterans. And it is a national disgrace that we have let it get to this point, and that this is overshadowed by so many other political conversations and discussions.
Exactly.
It should be a national effort to fix this VA, where every member of Congress is also considering measures like the Veteran Empowerment Act or other solutions to fix the situation at the VA. The VA for a very long time, it has been growing and growing and growing unchecked. It owes the Treasury Department $226 million, and it owes third-party private practitioners millions of dollars as well. So it has a tremendous debt, and at the same time, it's mismanaging its money. So what we need is for legislators to seriously put together a committee like a BRAC committee. Every so often, they look at which military bases need to be closed or realigned. Yeah. We need to support bills like the VA Realignment Act. And I believe the name of the bill is the VA Asset and Infrastructure Realignment Act. And there's a piece of legislation. This piece of legislation would look at where the VA invests its money, what hospitals have excess capacity or that are crumbling and falling apart and need to be shut down, what property out there can get sold off or rented out or whatever.
Diego,
because right now,
we're about out of time here, so I suggest that the listeners certainly call their congressmen, their representatives, and challenge them on passing some of these things. Diego, thanks for reaching out, and please come back, because I don't want to let this kind of fall on the floor. I mean, this absolutely needs to stay fresh and stay in the conversation. So I'm inviting you back in after the holidays in January, and let's continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. So thank you, Diego, and stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you these two 24/7 streams of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. Talk America Radio is a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. Please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. You can contribute monthly or send us a one-time amount. We'll put it to good use continuing to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
ATA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. It wasn't too long ago that I had Father Dwight Longenecker with us, and we were talking about the advertising with the Washington, D.C. metro system and the fact that they were turning down the advertising that the Archdiocese there had wanted to use. And so Father Dwight Longenecker has decided to come back and talk to us a little bit about Jerusalem, because obviously it is back in the headlines again. So Father Dwight, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Happy to join you.
You know, this thing with Jerusalem has been so contested for, just decades and decades, well, centuries maybe, I suppose, because they've had so many conquering hostilities for so long. But Father, what's the most common misconception that you have found when it comes to Jerusalem that just never seems to get corrected the way it needs to be?
Well, actually, if you talk about the conflict being there for decades and centuries, we can even say actually for millennia, because when you read the Old Testament and the Jews going up to the Promised Land and going in and conquering the land, and then you hear about David, the boy David, fighting the Philistines. Well, the Philistines, and the word Philistine is actually from the same root as the word that we get for Palestine and Palestinians. And so Jews fighting Philistines and Jews fighting Palestinians, it's the same territory. It's the descendants of the same people. And even down to the fact that sometimes when you see the videos of what's going on over there, you see young men sort of running up and throwing rocks and so forth at soldiers. That's just like, the boy David with his slingshot, winging it at Goliath from the Old Testament story. So this reminds us that this territory, these same mountains and valleys and this same fertile territory between the mountains and the sea, it's been contested for not just decades and hundreds of years, but really for thousands of years.
Thousands.
Yeah, and so the history there is rich, and the rich history is abundant, and the blood that's been shed in that area has unfortunately been, part of human history.
But we seem to be giving, I guess we have the wrong definition of Palestine, because everybody seems to think, Father, that Palestine is only Israel. And that's why there's always that contested territory. And it's not, is it?
No, and then the Palestinian territories, again, remember, the borders that we see on the map today of, Palestine and the countries that are there, of Palestine and Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and so forth, a lot of these borders are relatively recent determinations by international commissions like the League of Nations and then the United Nations and so forth. And that's a lot of what causes a lot of the troubles out there. The people who actually live there had these borders imposed on them. And so this is why the struggles continue.
Yeah. One thing that kind of gets left out of all of this, and I'm confused with it myself, so maybe you can help out, is the Sinai is a big part of this equation, and nobody really includes the Sinai. Why is that?
Well, I'm afraid that the whole thing is so extremely complicated with the history and even the recent history of it. Is that the Sinai, as I understand it, was Egyptian territory, and then most of it was taken in the 1967 war by Israel, who suddenly overcame their enemies in an astounding upset. And this has been the whole point of the treaties that have been going on since then, to try to determine who's going to control it and who's going to have that territory.
Thank you. So the Sinai is actually still somewhat in dispute, I would argue, as well. But there also comes the fact that Syria and Lebanon, at one point, they were one country, correct?
As far as I know. Again, you're catching me on the hop here too a little bit, because the history of the whole area is extremely complex. And it all depends how far back in the history you want to go. The borders have been changed time and again. It's difficult to actually pin down exactly what your question is.
Sorry. It's I am kind of jumping around when it comes to the timeline. But when we have the first city wall, and later there were more walls that were added. And then, the walls were necessarily destroyed in Jerusalem. Can you talk a little bit about those and what those walls were for, and then who destroyed them?
You mean the walls that are there now?
Yes.
Well, the history of Jerusalem goes right back to prehistoric times. And the walls that are there now are relatively recent. They were built on the foundations of the old walls of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself as a city was destroyed completely twice. And it's been besieged many times, it's been attacked many times. And so although you go to the old city of Jerusalem, you can certainly walk through the old city. We have to remember that those walls that are built are comparatively modern walls. And the barriers dividing the city into 4 sectors is comparatively recent. We can certainly walk over we're certainly there in the very ancient territory of where Jesus lived and where Solomon built his temple and so forth. But what we see when we're actually there is relatively recent.
Modern. Yeah, when it comes to the temples, can you share a little bit with the audience on what happened with King David and then the Solomon's temples, if you would?
Yeah, the history of Jerusalem goes right back into, Bible believers would say that it goes back to the time of Abraham, when Abraham, in the book of Genesis, which is way back to sort of around 2000 BC, was met by someone called Melchizedek in Genesis 14, and he came out and Melchizedek was called the king of Salem, and Salem was the earlier name for Jerusalem. There is actually evidence of Canaanite tablets referring to a city called Jerusalem, which goes back even further, several thousand years. But we can begin to really trace the history of Jerusalem from the reign of King David. And roughly, to think in your timeline, you're talking about 1000 BC. So 1000 years after Abraham, roughly, comes David and Solomon, who then really built the city. And that's when really the real historical evidence begins to click in as well. And so that's why the Jews make this claim that, they say this is the land promised to us by God to our father Abraham. Moses and Joshua led the people into the land out of Egypt, and then they say David and Solomon established our capital there, 3,000 years ago. This is their great claim, and so they want to continue to claim that Jerusalem is their capital. And they did that when in the modern era. After the Second World War, the Jews returned to the Holy Land, and eventually around 1947, they declared their independence and declared their own country, and at that point they said Jerusalem is our capital. Many nations did not recognize their claim because of the sensitivities in the area, but it's in the news today because, of course, President Trump has now declared that America will recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and recognize their claims.
Well, the Palestinians have a capital, so should the Jews be able to legitimately and historically claim that Jerusalem is the capital?
They both claim it as their capital. that's the big fuss. Of course, the Palestinians and many of the other Arab nations in the Middle East deny the reality of the state of Israel completely and want it to cease to exist, and they don't want them, and they see the claim of Jerusalem by the Jews to be yet more aggression on the part of the Jews to continue to take over and to settle there permanently. So this is where the fuss is. I personally think that I don't see why people can't work this out in some way. After all, a good illustration is that the center of the Catholic faith is the Vatican City, and the Vatican City exists as a little enclave within the capital of Rome, which is the capital of Italy. So there's ways to get around these things, but of course, both parties have to be willing.
Well, historically, I mean, the Palestinians have been offered a lot of deals, and they seem to have turned them down. They gave up the area known as Gaza, and that wasn't enough. And then you have certainly the East Bank and the West Bank, and that hasn't been enough. Does the timeline of the history of the area necessarily known as Israel and of Jerusalem, does it get negated by much more modern day claims of the Palestinians, do you think, Father?
Well, I think when you look back a little bit further into the history of the area between the end of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine time period, you go up through the Middle Ages, from about the 7th century onward, the city of Jerusalem in that area really was dominated by the various different Islamic powers. And therefore, their claim as the Muslims and the Palestinians, the Arabs, to that territory seems pretty strong because they seem to have been there for so long over this long stretch from about the 7th century right on through the Middle Ages. Now, during the Middle Ages, it swung back and forth. Sometimes the Western powers would invade and take Jerusalem and take part of that territory. They were always squabbling over, but they do have this historic claim. But the Jews are coming in and saying, this is our ancient land. We claim this land from even more ancient times than you do. So, they're the ones who are. I don't see any way around it if both parties are not willing to actually sit down and come to a solution.
Mm-hmm. Is Jordan actually playing some kind of a role in all of this when it comes to the timeline and what the ownership necessarily is in peace parts of Jerusalem?
I think all the different countries over there are trying to are sitting at the table, and Jordan is one of the adjacent countries. Jordan certainly seems to be one of the more peaceful players in the mix. But how do you solve that problem? How do you square the circle?
Well, therein lies the question. I mean, it's been going on 40 or 50 years in some kind of various talks, and we seem not to be able to, get past the timeline or the lines that were drawn. I mean, we had the lines essentially that were drawn in 1948, and then we had other kind of lines that were drawn or ownership that was drawn in 1967. And as you say, that's more of a modern day kind of situation. So it necessarily negates its history.
And it was from 1948 to 1967 that supposedly the Israelis and the Jordanians were ruling the area together with a kind of partition. But the War of 1948 then resulted in the division of Jerusalem, so that the old walled city was cut right down the middle with Jordanians on one side and Israelis on the other side. And then after the 1967 war, people wanted Jordan to remain neutral during the Six-Day War in 1967, but they then soon stepped in and took the side of the Arabs as well. So since then, the Jews have been trying to take, to move more and more people in so that their claim is even stronger.
Yes. When it comes to, it's kind of fascinating because I think there's probably 2 or 3, maybe 4,000 archaeological sites that are tangible evidence of the history. Father, do these archaeological finds and these treasures, do they have any impact on the argument, do you think, or this debate?
Well, I think they could have an impact in as much as they're trying to. I think a lot of the motivation of the Israelis on doing all these archaeological digs is to try to cement their claim and to substantiate the Old Testament history. They're very keen on establishing the links with King David and King Solomon and taking those bits of history straight back to show that the land belongs to them. I don't know if the Arabs, the Palestinians, take much notice of those things, because I suppose they will say, look at the same history, like I said at the beginning, we were here first, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I think time will tell. One of the big crises over there is also to remember this is not just a Jewish-Muslim issue, that this is also a holy city for Christians. And that Christians are increasingly being driven out of their historic lands in what are now Islamic countries. And I think many of the Jews are more sympathetic to the Christians' claims of this being our holy land as well. But there's not a lot of love there either between Jews and the Christians. So that adds another layer of complications to it all.
Indeed, it does. We have, certainly we have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and it's we have today what the Jews are necessarily protecting, the Israelis are protecting, but then again, they're really not allowed to step onto that piece of real estate. And I would argue what's underneath the Dome of the Rock. Can you kind of expand on that for us?
I think that the Jews have been trying to. rumors that the Jews were making some excavations from, from the Wailing Wall in underneath the Dome of the Rock to try to find what is there, and again to try to establish links back to Solomon's Temple and so forth. The Muslims, meantime, are hugely protective of that area. I can remember visiting there some years ago as a tourist and going into both of those mosques, which you're allowed to do. But I think I gave some kind of an indication that I was praying. I don't know whether I took out a rosary or whether I crossed myself or something like that, just because I considered it to be a holy site. And some fellow with a machine gun sort of came up and started nudging me and saying, "You can't pray in here, like move on," kind of thing. So the tension there is always extremely high, because of all the religious feelings. This is not just a political issue. This is deeply felt spiritual and religious issues and nationalist issues, which are all sort of bubbling over in that same location. At the meantime, of course, there are some Jewish and Christian fundamentalists who believe that prophecy tells us that before the Messiah returns, the Jews will return to their land and the temple will be rebuilt. That's why when they saw the Jews returning to the land in the 1940s and then winning the war in 1967, they were saying, "Whoa, look at this. Biblical prophecy is being fulfilled. The Jews, against all odds, have returned to the Holy Land. They've returned to Jerusalem, their capital. How soon are they going to rebuild the temple?" Of course, to rebuild the temple, they would have to remove those two mosques which are sitting up there. And so, and the Muslims know that too. They know that this is the site where some Jews, extremist Jews, want to rebuild the temple. So it's a powder keg. It's a highly sensitive area.
Indeed, it is. We also had the era of the Roman destruction in Jerusalem. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Well, the Jews were rebelling against the Romans, and they continued to rebel against them, despite the Romans putting them down in terrible, putting down the revolts in a terribly ruthless way. At one point, hundreds of Jews were crucified outside the city wall for rebelling, but they still rose up, believing again that this was their sacred city. This was the site of their sacred temple, their worship of God, and the Roman presence there was profaning that. And blaspheming against it. So this was a political and a religious motivation. And finally, in 70 AD, around the years before 70 AD, General Titus was sent to finally quell this Jewish rebellion once and for all. He besieged the city of Jerusalem. There was terrible starvation, which reduced people to cannibalism and dying of thirst. And finally, the city broke down. The Romans came in and leveled the whole city, scattered the ground with salt, and it was a desolation. They destroyed the temple and leveled the walls, and eventually, sometime later, rebuilt the city based on Roman lines. And the Jews were banished, were not allowed to come into the city at all. Even after it became a Christian city in the 4th century, Jews were still banished from ever returning to Jerusalem. So it was a terrible destruction, and this is the great dispersion of the Jews all over Europe and all over the world when they were banished from the Holy Land.
And prior to that, then we had kind of the Persian invasion under Cyrus, correct?
Well, yes, but that. If you're referring to the Persian invasion under Nebuchadnezzar, that was 5 centuries before, of course, in 586 BC, when Solomon's temple was actually destroyed. So in 586 BC, Solomon's temple was destroyed by the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. The Jews were dispersed. But after a rather short time, they were allowed to come back. That was under Cyrus that they were able to return to the land, and they rebuilt a smaller version of the temple at that point. It's called the Second Temple. And it was that Second Temple that Herod the Great then sort of rebuilt and expanded, trying to match the grandeur of Solomon. And that's the temple that would have stood there during the time of Jesus' life. And it was Herod the Great, that same Herod, that the wise men came to visit on their way to pay homage to Jesus.
Yeah, lots of a lot of messages here, Father. Lots of conflicting ones, and to kind of keep things in perspective, there was so much that was happening in one particular area, one particular section of real estate. It's real hard to have any kind of loyalty or sympathies, or you almost don't know where to kind of focus.
Well,
for the sake,
go
ahead.
It is difficult to figure that out. But I think one of the things which brings to light about Jerusalem is that in the Middle Ages, Jerusalem was considered to be the center of the world. And if you look at the globe from a particular point of view, it does kind of seem like the center of the world, in as much as it was in the ancient times and still is today a very strategic and crucial crossroads of all the continents. So one of the reasons it was so vital in ancient times was that it was the main thoroughfare between Persia, the great kingdoms of Persia, Greece, Rome, and Egypt. And to get back and forth, you had to pass through this little strip of land. And even today, it's still a very crucial and strategic little bit of real estate, because you've got the big muscle of Russia and China and India to the east, and then you've got Europe and the economic powers of Rome and Europe and America to the west, and then you've got the huge continent of Africa, and right there's little Israel stuck right in the middle of all of it.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you made that. Now, you have a book, Mystery of the Magi. Tell us about it.
Well, it ties right in with all of that, because I've come up with what I believe is the answer of who were the wise men and why did they visit Jesus in Bethlehem. And my theory is that they were actually from the Arabian kingdom of Nabatea. This is the kingdom directly to the east of Herod and the Judeans. And during Roman times, they were very wealthy traders. They traded goods from India and China coming across the Arabian Peninsula in camel caravans to the port of Gaza, which is, of course, what we call the Gaza Strip, the port of Gaza there on the shore of the Mediterranean. And also they controlled the routes from Egypt going north to Syria and Asia Minor, and their capital was Petra. So this very wealthy country just to the east of Judea, I reckon, were where the Magi came from and brought their gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And my book goes into all the details about that, and it ties right in with the events in the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus' birth, and the politics and the economics of the time, which is still, the same sort of pressures are there today, with the mighty, wealthy empire of Saudi Arabia to the east, and looking over the shoulder and on little Israel sitting right there with their backs to the sea.
Yes, it is. Well, congratulations on the book. It's very timely, and we certainly appreciate your time and your responses to what is going on there. Father Dwight Longenecker, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.